That's on the wrong.
Is there an orphan Zoom again?
I don't know. I see someone else's name on the other in the list. I'm looking in the wrong place. I put someone in the wrong place. Never mind. Okay.
I can go.
Okay. It's my fault. I was just in the wrong place in the doc. Okay. All right. Well, if we're recording and no one else has stepped up to host, I will. So welcome everybody. This is the Tinkerbell contributors meeting, and I think if there are any new faces, I think I maybe see some people who, if anyone wants to introduce yourself, you are welcome to do so. No pressure. Let's see. Important thing. So in the calendar invite, there should have been a link to the agenda, which I will place in the chat for anyone who doesn't have it somehow. And linked from there is our code of conduct. So please be excellent to each other. And I don't see no one has signed up for any show and tell or any other agenda topics. And although Micah, if you want to move yours to the regular agenda, that's totally fine. I was specifically linking, there's one of the things that we have in the triage is there is a label within the project for items for discussion, which triagers can apply, and that puts things up into a certain section of the triage board. And so I figured we should also maybe bubble those up in the community meeting because not everyone comes to the triage meetings. Yeah. So with that, I think Micah, you have the first item.
Cool. Yeah. I just linked the proposal for like Kubernetes resource model. Just wanted to see if put it out there again to see if anyone else had comments on it. Marcus, I think you left some, and I need to. I have an in progress update to address most of the things that you talked about. But I think based on the discussion we had like 4, maybe 6 weeks ago, seems like a lot of people, like based in the demo, a lot of people seem really positive about it. So if anyone else has more comments, positive or negative, like please put those in there too. I'll try to get that update in today with updated responses, but please take a look. I'd love to see progress on this too. And I also have a PR open on Tink with some of the initial API design. So if you want to look there too, I don't have any of the sort of Kubernetes control bits, but just want to get some initial agreement on an alpha version of the API. Yeah, that's all from me.
Sweet, am I up?
You're up, Jacob.
Apologies for being late. Thanks for running the show here, Tim. So I'm working with a couple other folks. Actually, one of them on the call, Scott Garman and Raj. We are actually working on updating Tink Worker. At the moment, if you're familiar with Tink Worker, there's very little tests. It's kind of just like this one long function that does everything. Anyway, so just kind of a heads up, I guess we're refactoring that. We're hoping to make it extremely tested and understandable and create a bunch of docs. So if and there's Ross, she just joined, awesome. If you're interested in collaborating with us, yeah, hit us up on Slack, but otherwise we will be chugging away. We will be putting a proposal out here, hopefully definitely before our next meeting, hopefully within this week. For kind of what changes that we'll be looking at. So, Micah, do you have a question?
Yeah, no, I'm really excited to hear about that. I'd love to participate in that too. A question I had that occurred to me kind of about Tink Worker and Tinkerbell in general is like it works obviously really well for provisioning servers. But has anyone played with adding actions beyond just like server provisioning? Like you can sort of add, I could see a way where you could easily write actions that do all kinds of other things on an existing host that maybe just has Linux or something and has Docker, right? Where Tinkerbell worker is run and can now just do arbitrary, it's a workflow engine, right? Has anyone like tried to do other actions besides like provisioning a host with Tinkerbell?
I've done it, but not in a very serious manner. So
Okay.
yeah, I have one that runs, and I've been playing with it to do BMC interactions, but I haven't actually done any. It hasn't been done. It is just me messing around. So I don't know if anybody else has done anything, but
yeah, I know Gianluca had experimented with some of that as well, even going so far as playing around with like hostless Tink worker where, you know, you just have a Tink worker running somewhere and just arbitrarily running things. And we had discussed potentially incorporating some of the PB&J integration in a similar way to where you basically just have like a pool of Tink workers sitting somewhere and they can execute those power management operations.
Yeah. Yeah. I've thought of things like, okay, SSH into this box and do this thing. Install SCP Tinkerbell into this box. And then now how you have a Tink worker in the box to do things. But yeah, I just was curious if anyone had played around with that. Okay. But that I'm excited to hear about the Tink worker work. That's great.
I do have a question about that, Jacob.
Yes.
I know in the past we've discussed either removing the defaulting to the localized internal registry for pulling down the actions or having a way to override that behavior. Is that something that's also included in this refactoring work, or is that still
100
some separate that we need to handle?
100%. Yeah, that's actually one of the bigger things too. Yeah, the plan is, I apologize, I don't have the proposal out, but yes, we will support authenticated, unauthenticated, private, public. We want to just wherever you want now. I think we've seen from the community at least that we don't necessarily need to be tied to one private single repo. So yes, we are planning definitely to add all registries and even maybe multiple registries with auth. That might come in a later version, but we might support like public and then one authenticated repo at the moment, I think, and then maybe we'll get to multiple authenticated. But I think any public one and then one authenticated is kind of what we're shooting for the first iteration of.
Awesome. I think that'll go a long way towards simplifying the bootstrapping as well. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. Cool. That's all I had for the Tink worker. Any other comments or questions? Sweet. I apologize. I have one more. I talked, I think, briefly last time we met about a doc fest, as I'm calling it. I've started the plan and preparation for that. The idea is the first week or two in December to do the doc fest. We'll have I'll be sending out this week more info to the mailing list, hopefully something more official with dates and like what the structure actually looks like. But what I did want to do, if people were interested in possibly, if you are in any of the repos and you see items that would be great for this kind of doc fest, if you could tag them or with labels. If you don't have label permission and you're interested in doing that, just reach out to us on Slack. There is a kind documentation label. If you wouldn't mind doing that, I'm hoping to add another label called like DocFest here as well to add something on that lines. Yeah, Micah.
Yeah, another question on that. You don't have to have an answer for this. It's more just a thought that I had. Okay. As we have proposals that move through Tinkerbell, like, okay, there's Kubernetes resource model thing, or just other things, right? Like PB&J, anything that sort of changes significantly changes or breaks documentation. What's our sort of like, do we have a plan for how docs get updated with work? I know there's like the checkbox in like like pull request template, but anything beyond that, like when even future looking stuff like, oh, this like PB&J doesn't integrate yet, but we mention it in the docs. Like what point do we start adding docs for future work? Maybe there's not an answer, but I'm curious about thoughts on that.
I'll give a thought in the pause here. On Crossplane, the way that was addressed was with the checkbox, like as you're making a pull request, if you know you're breaking the docs, you try to fix those docs. But as we approached the various O.X.O release milestones, we took a pass through the docs and made sure that the docs made sense before we tagged and released things. And I think the problem here is that we haven't been doing the semver tagging. So
we don't have any releases.
Well, so the closest thing we have are the tags on the sandbox repo right now. And I think at some point we need to have a, honest discussion about how do we handle versioning and release and that sort of thing between the components. We've kind of just deferred that to the sandbox for now. And that's kind of been good enough as people are just experimenting with it. But as more and more people are actually running this in real environments, that starts to fall down. So I think, yes, it's complicated. And we haven't, as a community, decided what's the appropriate thing for the way that we did this. Like at one point we had binary releases for the sandbox, but I don't necessarily know that that's the answer as well. I think, we need to define, the actual interaction between the components, have real releases for those individual components, and then, define how we expect compatibility to work, across various versions and that sort of thing. And those aren't the easiest discussions to have. They tend to, different people have different thoughts on how that should work and that sort of thing. But I think it's something that we're going to have to tackle probably within this upcoming year as adoption is increasing.
To that, I'm sorry, I'm derailing your point, Jacob, about docs. But on the point about releases, do we want to do a release soon if we know about changes like Kubernetes model, so that we can say this version is pre that change or post that change, or do we just not want a release and say that's the new way going forward?
So as far as the sandbox releases, there hasn't been anything that we've really done there to enforce when a release happens. It's just, somebody says, I'd like to have a release to include the latest stuff, and that's about it. With the Kubernetes resource model stuff coming in, I think that would be a good point to have a release prior to there. If there are any features, bug fixes, or anything like that haven't been included in the sandbox yet that we think really needs to make a release. But I don't know anything off the top of my head that has landed in that period that we necessarily need to cut a release for at this point.
Yeah, I would. So my thoughts are that like the sandbox releases have given us a nice way to avoid the conversation, I think, about individual repos having releases. But I don't know if that's it. I don't know if wanting to do and get a standardized release for all the repos before your Kubernetes changes drop is something you want, because that could be a longer conversation. And not only that, it's going to be a lot of work for all the repos, and it's going to be a change to a lot of flows, right? Now, maybe that is the case you want, because you want it very clear that, hey, now in this, 0.1.1 or something has the Kubernetes, sure, but just a consideration, right? There is a significant amount of input, I imagine, that will be had I mean, speaking from maybe like the Equinix metal internal stuff, like we're not used to releases. We just go
Yeah.
grab things. So that will be a significant thing. And I'm assuming lots of other people will have opinions and thoughts, and it might just the nature, I think, of our community at the moment is probably going to stretch a little bit. And so just a heads up, I guess, if you don't want your stuff to, if you want to get your stuff in right away, probably don't push release stuff.
Yeah.
We kind of will probably need ones though. Simply the fact that we're going to have an API that's going to be shared between repos, and you want sort of semantic versions of that API.
Agreed.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we'll probably want to do before we actually cross that bridge is take an introspective look at the current state of things and where we want things before we are ready to make, those commitments. I think one of the things that I've seen is that sometimes people rush, the process, and then it leads to really awkward situations and, creates more work than it's worth. I think it's something that we probably need to tackle within this next year, having real versioned releases of components. But I think we want to probably figure out, try to land some of the things for the improvements that we want before we go ahead and make those things, and just stick with the sandbox release process for now. So if there's anything that we want before the Kubernetes changes in a sandbox release, let's go ahead and cut that. And then we can do a post release. And then, it gives us a easier point to align the docs for this moment.
Where would be the best place to continue? Because I mean, this is a 1 hour phone call every 2 weeks that doesn't include folks in APAC, right? What's the best place to continue like this? Would it be an enhancement proposal for a release or for releases in general? Or would a discussion on Tink
I think for formal releases, I think we probably do want a proposal and, open the discussion and open it up to a broader forum. We'll want to broadcast it early, often, and get input, and then try to wrangle, what's the right thing to do from there. It's difficult. It's complicated. It's going to be messy. It's going to take a while to come to a general consensus of how we proceed. Having been there and having those types of discussions in the past, it's not fun, but it's often necessary.
Yeah, I echo that. I think, and I'd say actually maybe start in Tink discussion, get that going, and then because the proposal process is more like you got to fill out the doc, and so you can do that. And I think that, like Jay said, we will definitely need that. But I think in the short term, a Tink discussion would probably be extremely beneficial, just to start people talking and getting opinions out there and whatnot.
Okay, great.
Yeah, this is a long overdue. It's come up numerous times, but I think maybe it's time to actually start doing some of the heavy lifting to make it a reality. But yeah, thanks for bringing that up. So if you'll indulge me to digress a little bit back to DocFest.
Please do. I'm sorry.
No, this is great. I really appreciate that. There's still some interesting stuff, and Nahum, thanks for capturing that. You did bring up a couple of points. I'll get to those about like how do we keep docs up to date, but let me just do a couple of DocFest kind of things. I'll send out more information this week to the mailing list. A couple of things that I will be looking for, if anyone is interested in being available during the DocFest, it's almost certainly going to be like 1 or 2 days, maybe longer, but available to review PRs. If you would mind just hitting me up on Slack, or after I send out the Google Groups notification, just maybe I should create like a sign up genius or something, but it would be really helpful. One of the ideas we want is that there's a group of people standing by to do reviews in lots of different time zones. So when people make contributions, we can make sure that they actually happen. That would be extremely helpful. And then just in general, if you want to contribute, that'd be awesome too, to do any kind of docs. So I guess there's kind of 3 requests at the in the just kind of short term is sign up for helping the PR review, tag things with kind documentation, and I'll be putting a new label called DocFest out. You can tag with that too. Create any new issues, create as many of these as you can. For any docs that you know that you want done, that need updated, just start throwing those issues out and we'll get a bunch on the board. The last time I checked with Thomas, actually, we found there were about 19 issues that had the docs label on it. We're looking to push that up maybe a little bit more and get a bunch of those out. So yeah, thanks everyone. If you're interested, reach out and we can get more info and whatnot. Thanks for taking notes. Or who's that? Or Jason? Both of you, thanks.
All the notes. I had one quick thought tied to some of this stuff. So I wonder if I've worked in code bases that have a giant mono repo where all the components are in one place. And if the documentation lives in the same mono repo, then it's really easy to make sure that a feature pull request are there commits that are touching the documentation as well? Can you just merge it all? Documentation comes along with the feature. And I wonder whether, so as of today, the sandbox and the documentation website are 2 separate repos. And I wonder whether they are closely related, and the sandbox repo has a bunch of README documentation in it as well, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. And I wonder whether, and maybe this is yet another proposal of like finding a way to consolidate the documentation and the sandbox in such a way that if you have a new feature that's landing in again, this maybe also be tied to releases, but when a release is happening, then the sandbox advancing to include those new features going along with the documentation for those features, finding ways to have fewer different repositories that someone has to touch in order to make sure that all the things are happening. Go ahead, Jason.
Yeah, so I think something along that lines too. I think we might be able to get away with sourcing parts of the documentation from different areas as well. So when changes are made to Boots, we can have the documentation for Boots live there, and then the website kind of compiles the documentation from the various sub-repositories and compiles it into the resulting thing. I know there are various ways to do that with some of the different publishing mechanisms out there. I've dealt with this a little bit with like Netlify. I don't know exactly what we use for the Tinkerbell docs right now, but there should be a similar way that we can do that. Or even if we have to do something ugly like, I can't believe I'm actually suggesting this, but Git submodules or something to import the documentation. I agree with you. The closer the documentation that lives with the code, the easier it is to ensure that the documentation is updated as things go on.
Yeah, that could, I don't know if that needs a proposal per se, but like, maybe a just straight up PR into one of those docs, the org repo that does something like that. Because I'm sure if somebody is willing to take the time to like figure that out and be able to pull that doc, I'll approve it right away. Right? I don't know there'll be much opposition. I'm assuming, hopefully not. Right? Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'm looking right now to see who are the main contributors to the or to the website, and then figure out if somebody involved, like if depending on who's involved, we may be able to lean on their expertise on the best way to follow up. So I'll take that up as a follow-up action to figure out next steps there.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks. All right. And we on
Yeah.
move. Or Micah, you had more on releases, or was that just kind of to catch the document?
That's just to document the discussion, and
Okay.
yeah, I created just started a discussion on the Tink repo.
Awesome.
So yeah, during the triage, there are a couple of items that are marked for discussion in the biweekly triage board. I have linked them in the notes. So yeah, the first one there should be the improved access to hook logs. I'm not sure exactly what the current state of that conversation is. Do we have some sense, Jacob, maybe you have some sense of what the status of that is? Is there indeed still need for discussion, or is that label out of date?
Yeah, I mean, we could discuss it. I think the bigger need maybe is like just somebody to put something out there. Dan did comment, Finneran did comment about having some work in progress. So I think it'd be highly beneficial for us to see what he's got. Maybe work pushing that forward. But yeah, I'm not aware of any work in hook specific, right? So I do know that, I apologize, I don't know his actual name is RGL, his GitHub handle. He created a completely new Aussie, which has logging in it. So, and we know the old the old Aussie has logging. But yeah, I think we just need some help. I did put a help wanted label on it. We just need some. We need somebody's cycles, please.
Okay. And then the other one here, Graham opened this one back in 2020, and it's been sitting around, and it got labeled by Gaurav, who's not here today either, about action images are tightly tied to Aussie. Not sure there's a whole lot of discussion here right now. It seems like the basic thought is there are certain things you may want to do in an action that are dependent on whether or not the kernel supports it. And I think some of the examples here were like ZFS. What was the other one? Support an action.
Yeah, he just had like
Yeah,
the kernel modules in general, I think.
Yeah,
right?
IP tables, NVIDIA drivers, things like that. Yeah.
He does bring up this idea. It's just an idea, right? But I don't know how feasible. Lightweight VMs or something. I think that's a great idea. I don't know how feasible it is, right? Like, I don't know if you get enough access to the host to do what you need to do, but if you did, I think that would be pretty awesome because you could provide your own kernel with all this stuff, which I think would be a pretty huge win. I know internally we could benefit highly at Equinix Metal on some of that stuff. So
Yeah, but you have to like consider like when we're loading kernel modules for like hardware support, right? And then having to deal with all the pass-through stuff. I mean, it's entirely possible, right?
sure,
and
sure.
presumably an interface that's extensible enough could be provided that like, you know, people can do whatever they wanted. But I think in practice, it's a lot more work than it seems.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a nice idea. Like I was saying, like if somebody could POC it or prove it out, I think that would be the next step, which would be huge. But yeah, the feasibility and how straightforward it is, I don't know. Anybody else have any thoughts there?
Yeah, and I wonder if that's some of that is just, again, like I'm very strongly of the opinion that within any given environment, making it easier for people to understand how to spin up their own kernel and RAM disk that can be a Tink worker and how to customize it to their needs might be the right way forward. Like Hook is a really nice lightweight example. Aussie's there if anyone wants to look at how we've done it in production at Equinix Metal. RGL has built one out of Debian. I think there's maybe there's actually the documentation that we're missing is here's how to take any Linux live environment or any Docker capable live environment and turn it into a Tink worker so that you can then build your own live environment that has every single software and hardware driver that you need for your thing. I guess the complicating factor there is if someone wanted to make an action available that depends on one of those pieces of hardware. So let's say that they created an NVIDIA specific action to do like burn in on an NVIDIA GPU, or a ZFS specific action to create a Z pool and lay down an operating system in a ZFS pool. That to open source those actions, you'd have to put the caveat, by the way, you need a Tink worker running in a live environment that supports this feature. And I guess that's some of the complication. Jason, I bet you have thoughts.
Yeah, I was just going to mention, I think what this is telling me more is that what we really need is some type of metadata on actions and some way to expose capabilities on, the OC host, so that we can match up and have an easy way to say that like this action is incompatible with the environment that it's running in. Again, not an easy discussion to have, but like taking just something simple like the kexec action, you can expose, needs, kexec support. And when we're building hook, we can sit there and lay down something on the host that the Tink worker can read and say, yes, we have the capability to run kexec. It would still come down to documentation to say that, one, you actually need support for this in the host, but you also have to expose that you have that support through, a file existing somewhere, or, a TOML or JSON or YAML document that could be found to read the metadata of what you expose, that sort of thing. But is that, is there value in that, or are most people going to be running hook? How many people are going out of the way? Is it worth it to implement something like that versus just saying you really shouldn't do that, or if you do, here are the caveats? I don't have a good answer for that.
I do like the idea that you bring up, Nahum, this idea of if we could make it easier to swap the Aussie, I think that would be a really cool idea. And then couple that with like labeling. Micah and I have talked about labeling, because if you think about labeling, if I apologize, if people are familiar with like Kubernetes, right, you can add these types of labels and then deployments will go to certain nodes, right? Maybe there's some way to do this kind of idea within our own stack so that you could have actions that map to Aussie environments or something like that. Or anyways, it's not a full-fledged idea. I apologize for just throwing it out there, but Mike and I have generally talked about this idea of labels, which I think would be really helpful. And so maybe the combination of the two could be something cool, but yeah.
Yeah, I think labeling in general would come in handy for a lot of things anyway. Because I know, like, looking at the cluster API integration and stuff, I'd love to just say, how can I identify hardware that I want to be made available for this? And we're working around it right now, but having a native way to sit there and just query the hardware and be able to limit things down would go a long way. I think the other aspect of it too is more than just labels, having the ability to expose actual the actual infrastructure. And then that goes back to, how we talked about like hardware detection and that sort of thing. How do we ingest these things, pre-populate, that sort of thing. But that's yet another discussion, I think.
Yeah, so for present attendees, and maybe hopefully if we ever have future attendees watching this video, labeling proposal would be, I think you'd get lots of interest and you could contribute quite well if somebody's interested in throwing some kind of ideas around labeling and getting something out there. So.
Just taking some notes. I see a raised hand. Go for it.
Yeah.
Hey, this is Pooja. I think I joined one meeting earlier. I work in Micah's team. And I was just kind of starting to scratch surface here with Tinkerbell and start looking into it. I had a couple questions to ask here. I did see in the Tinkerbell repo that there is a Kubernetes box that has been created. And what that looks like is just to stand up the entire box on Kubernetes. So it's like kind plus KubeVirt, meaning the workers will also be on there using KubeVirt. And so you pretty much have like a data center in a box, kind of basically a sandbox that we do with Vagrant or whatever. And I see that in there, it's all like kind plus KubeVirt combination changes. So any network changes that have been made are of keeping in mind the kind plus KubeVirt combination. What I was wondering and looking to see is if whether anyone tried running the Tinkerbell stack itself, kind cluster, and what kind of network hacks has it acquired, if at all.
Yeah, so it's complicated. And you were mentioning running the Tink workers in KubeVirt. I went down that specific rabbit hole quite a few months ago, and I ended up abandoning it because I couldn't get that all working within a kind cluster and having everything actually on the same L2 network, because at the end of the day, boots needs to be on an L2 network, or you have to have some type of a DHCP forwarder involved to be able to get the VMs or physical machines to actually DHCP boot. And that was the biggest challenge with trying to get it all running inside of Kubernetes. The simple answer is you can just run it host port, and that works, gets you direct L2 connectivity with boots, but it doesn't give you the kind of, specific, this is the IP address that I'm going to be on, because it's going to change as it migrates between hosts, if one host goes down, that sort of thing, which may not actually be too big of an issue. But that's kind of the biggest challenge. Everything else can run in there. Some things actually need, I think boots is the only thing that actually needs host port. I think everything else just works just fine, with like a regular Kubernetes deployment and exposed via services or ingress or however. And the other thing is if you're running like a KubeVirt VM, and you do get it connected on an L2 network, the only way that you actually get direct L2 connectivity on that VM is using a Mac VTAP based networking. And that only works on a physical host, because if you try to do that inside of a container, it doesn't actually see the other end of that tap device within that container. So it actually appears on the host device instead of in the kind container that it's running in. So that's kind of why I abandoned that approach. But we are planning on having a more standardized Kubernetes-based deployment model, and I know that's something that I think Jacob can probably speak to a lot better than I can right now.
Before we, can I ask a clarifying question before Jacob does that? Pooja, were you asking about best practices for running the Tinkerbell stack under Kubernetes for a fleet of real machines, or or still more of a sandbox?
So let me step back here a little bit. So I kind of wanted to say that Jason's hole has been some of the rabbit holes that I've just come out of. But mainly, like, I think without giving away too much, I just wanted to see if I could run the entire Tinkerbell stack on a kind cluster locally, sort of use that as my bootstrap cluster. And then once my workload cluster is provisioned and it's a proper Kubernetes cluster running somewhere, then I could actually move the stack onto that. And, you know, getting the stack running on the Kubernetes cluster wasn't too bad at all. So I think I have that running fine. It was just that, you know, that initial bootstrap kind cluster, I thought it would be really nice to have the stack running there first in order to provision that initial first workload cluster that could then become a permanent management cluster. But, you know, kind is, you know, I ran into all those issues. I mean, it wasn't a must, but, you know, I got on that path and then I had to kind of fall the rabbit hole before I kind of said, okay, yeah, this is probably not the best idea. But so that kind of brings me to my follow-up question there is, you know, what I could do then is possibly run the Tinkerbell stack sort of on the side as Docker containers on my Bootstrap box, or whatever you want to call it, admin box that runs the Bootstrap cluster. It doesn't even have to run there, it can run anywhere. But then is there standardized way, or is there an already done way right now existing somewhere in your repos that can easily translate the Docker Compose to Kubernetes deployment installation for the stack?
So if I just want to make sure I fully understand, it sounds like the use case you have is you have a single server that you have like that you can remotely control relatively easily and install onto it relatively easily, and then you have a fleet of beefier machines, some of which you want to be your permanent like production cluster to manage then an even bigger fleet of machines. And so it's the bootstrapping of how do I install that first machine? How do I get the production cluster bootstrapped? How do I move the stack to the production cluster and then use that to manage the full fleet?
Absolutely. Yeah, you got it.
And so certainly like the expertise among the people who are on the call right now is that Equinix Metal certainly is running the Tinkerbell stack under Kubernetes. We have some Helm charts. I think they are currently proprietary, closed off within a closed off GitHub organization. It sounds like a useful thing is like, wouldn't it be great if we could have open source Helm charts for the Tinkerbell stack, so that ideally could work both on a Bootstrap node and in a production cluster? I think the answer, and this is where Jacob definitely jump in and correct me, like I think the answer is we don't have those open source as of today. It does seem like something we could and should move towards.
I think we have something, but it maybe not up to date.
Well,
I
yeah,
feel like you've already
they're-
solved this, Jason, haven't you? Because this is cluster API, right? You spin up and then you pivot. I mean, it sounds just like that. Is this something you're still working on, maybe?
So on the cluster API side, yes, we do have that. The problem is on the Tinkerbell side, because if you're like, and this is something that we've deferred on the cluster API side, is with the Tinkerbell providers, we've just said you need an existing Tinkerbell cluster. We don't handle the bootstrapping of Tinkerbell for you because there are all sorts of other dependencies in there too, because you got to ingest what available hardware you have and all of that fun stuff. So we haven't tackled that yet because that bootstrapping story for Tinkerbell isn't quite polished yet enough. As that Tinkerbell story gets polished off and we have a good story there, then that's something that we can incorporate on the cluster API side as far as the bootstrapping as well. And that's also kind of why I've been really interested in topics around how do we simplify the bootstrapping and requirements, because one of the things that I want to avoid, if at all possible, is taking on support of things like, HA deployments of Postgres and, how do we expand this beyond just, how do we make this production ready, that sort of thing. So the more things that we can defer off there, and I think Helm gives us some decent solutions there because there are some upstream Helm charts that we can potentially refer people to for the dependencies and maybe include those in dependencies of our charts and stuff like that. But I want to make sure that we're not wasting what little what little time and effort we have as a community in, you know, trying to support things that aren't core to Tinkerbell itself. And the more we can remove the need for the dependencies like the internal registry and the mirror host and things like that, the easier the bootstrapping is, the less community support we're doing for those bits of it. And I think that's kind of a requirement to get us in a place where we have public and supportable Kubernetes deployment manifests for Tinkerbell.
That makes sense. I'm sorry, somebody was going to say something more on that. Okay, yeah, I also just had another question. I know we're kind of close to the time. I think Micah touched on this a little bit. What I kind of wanted has, you know, has anybody experimented or has any real world cases where people want to run Tinkerbell stack sort of to do hybrid kind of provisioning, you know, where the Tinkerbell stack is you do the hook, and then fully provision an OS, and then stick the Kubernetes components on it using CAPT or whatever. Plus, there are some machines in the data center that are already provisioned, sort of like a IO, and they're saying, but I still want your workflow sort of for that hybrid environment where some machines need full provision, other machines have OS provision, but I just need Kubernetes provisioning on. Has any done, seen, thought about stuff like that?
So not that specific use case directly, but we've had, and this is going into more on the cluster API side, we've had discussions with folks that are potentially interested in incorporating Tinkerbell as part of a hybrid type solution with, you know, being able to provision in the cloud and also in the data center and things like that. And I think, you know, there's probably some practical implementation challenges that may exist between some of the different cluster API providers today. And I know that there are some folks like, is it, I can't remember if it's, I think it's Twilio and VMware are both working on kind of a bring your own host type cluster API provider that has that same requirement where the OS is already provisioned and it just does like the Kubernetes bits on top of that. I hesitate a little bit because there's a lot of foot gun action happening in that realm and things that can go wrong, unlike kind of like the model that we've kind of gone with CAPT with like the golden images model. But one of the things we're looking at is how do we enable that, you know, hybrid thing to where the control plane could potentially be on one set of, you know, backed by one infrastructure provider and workers could be on another infrastructure provider for that kind of hybrid kind of scale out type approach. And we'll be looking at ensuring that that works for both the Tinkerbell provider and tangentially the Equinix Metal provider as well. I'd expect other providers are going to start supporting that as well. So that should provide support for that in the long run, assuming that the Twilio / VMware collaboration around the bring your own host kind of provider materializes.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think somewhat of a similar CAPI provider from Weaveworks as well, just infrastructure types. Okay, cool. Yeah, thank you for that answer. Appreciate it.
Can I throw one other, I don't know if this was, you talked about this a little bit back. I don't know if it'll be helpful or not, but I thought I'd throw it out because I'm interested if anybody else has done. You talked about networking hacks. I started down the road and got pulled away, so I didn't get to fully prove it out, but I started playing with Tinkerbell and Kubernetes using Multis and Whereabouts. And I don't know if you're familiar with these, but Multis, I apologize if you do already know this, but maybe some other people don't. Multis gives you the ability to add an additional network interface in a pod, and you can make it MAC VLAN like we talked about. So it's on the host and it can hear that layer too. And then Whereabouts actually gives you the ability to have the same IP follow you when you move from host to host or things of that nature. And I got close, I got pulled away, but now conversation has made me interested to maybe finish that process. And I don't know if it's viable, and I know it's probably not related to some of the stuff Pooja you were talking about, but I thought I'd throw it out there too.
Yeah,
No,
so I think,
absolutely. I haven't in detail looked at Multis too much, but I did play around with Multis to get the stuff working. I wasn't
KubeVirt
completely
probably, right?
successful.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
I wasn't completely successful, but yes, I know exactly what you're talking about. Sorry, Jason.
yeah, no, I was just going to say, I think the biggest challenge is trying, like the experiment that I was trying to do was trying to create a replicatable and easily kind of provisionable kind of developer environment. And the problem that I had is you can't really just say that if you're a developer on this project, you have to use Linux. And once you sit there and look at trying to incorporate support for Windows or Mac OS, in addition to that, it gets really messy really quickly because the networking there behaves differently with the Kubernetes clusters and all that fun stuff. So the fact that everything didn't quite work the same and the kind container kind of blew up that experiment really quickly once I got to the point that I realized that Mac VTAP wasn't going to work inside of a container. But I think we potentially have opportunity going back to another topic that was brought up, which is maybe we can do the same thing in like a micro VM type environment. And then that's giving us the base Linux that we would need to provide that standardized environment. And then we can do everything that we need inside of there. So that might be something. I don't know how well the micro VMs work on Windows and Mac OS, but you know, it's difficult. It becomes crazy really fast, and additionally, so if you consider potential differences with container runtimes and how they may handle things slightly differently as well.
Yeah.
I had one other question for Pooja, which is before I joined Equinix Metal, I worked on a team that was managing a data center, and we evaluated the Tinkerbell project. It wasn't quite ready for us at that time. And one of the things the Tinkerbell project explicitly does not provide are things like DSIM and IPAM. And I'm curious if you're experimenting and if your sort of bootstrapping includes open source DSIM, IPAM type stuff of like whether it's Netbox or I'm familiar with Collins, because one of the things I would love to see within the Tinkerbell project is we're not going to provide a solution for that, but hey, here's documentation for how to spin up a bootstrap node that maybe includes something like Netbox, and then here's how to ingest your machines into Netbox, possibly then again like spin up a production cluster on some of those machines, and then ingest the rest of your machines into your DSIM, IPAM, whatever, and then provision a giant Kubernetes cluster for like a production workload would be a super nice end-to-end, here's how to run a data center with Tinkerbell as one of the foundational components. That's my question.
No, I haven't played around with an IPAM solution like that, but that sounds like a great idea. I mean, that would be ideal, honestly, for data center provisioning use case with Tinkerbell as the base.
Another
ahead,
call,
Jacob.
another call for a proposal. Somebody please help us make this integration. Yeah, because I'm on the same board. I think it'd be really cool too. And I know it's been floated, and if I'm not mistaken, there's tickets out there about Netbox and other kind of backing DSIMs and IPAMs. It'd be really cool, man. I would, yeah. So if anybody's interested.
We need to take a vacation and have a hackathon to hack on.
Right.
Yeah, well, I think the important thing is that we make sure that we don't force specific integrations, but rather we're defining how do we enable integrations with, particular solutions in mind. I think it's too easy to fall into, if you have Netbox, here's some weird integration that we do, rather than defining a proper kind of extension mechanism for that type of support.
Yeah, I mean, the nice thing is the architecture we have today, you push into Tink server and then
Yep.
and that's it. So as long as if you have Collins, and here's how to make Collins push to Tink server, or you have Netbox, here's how to make Netbox push to Tink server, then it's out of the hands of that tool. And then you can have your ingestion workflow that can boot up, and that one would be customized. Here's a workflow for ingesting into Collins, and here's a workflow for ingesting into Netbox. Again, these are just the two examples I'm familiar with. There's no reason that we have to be supporting any of them explicitly in the core of the project.
Sure. And
yes, we are at time. So thank you everyone for coming. We've taken some notes in the notes doc. If anything we missed, feel free to add it. And Jacob, next week is
triage party. And stay tuned for an email. If you're not in the Google groups, please do join. There'll be an email about the DocFest coming up. Thanks, y'all.